Welcome to the Yahowah blog. I am your host, Craig Wynn. On the morning of October 7th of 2023, I wrote an open letter to Israel. And in that open letter, I discussed what Israel's options would be and the consequence of those options long before any response was put into place or even contemplated. I published this open letter in the opening volume of a 5-volume series called Goddamn Religion. This is volume 4. There are 5 825-page volumes in this series. It's called At War with Religion. I then did a series of audio programs that were broadcast the following evening to share this letter with God's people. I'm going to return to it now after, well over a year. Because of the events that transpired and were announced yesterday, where the United States, and with the strong arm of a man that they thought they could trust, Donald Trump, convinced Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government to capitulate to the Islamic terrorists that raped their women, tortured their children, abducted elderly, children, babies, infants, women, men, and committed acts of mass murder while shouting Allahu Akbar, only to come back into Gaza and cheer the most abysmal behavior in recent human history. Then to see the entire world erupt as progressives joined Muslims in chanting death to Israel, celebrating their carnage, their savagery. And so at this time, now that Israel has rewarded the terrorists for doing what they did, by negotiating with them and giving them what they wanted, the very incentive that they sought from Israel for abducting women and children, this capitulation is so horrific. It is going to invite terror beyond Jewish imagination. And Jews have a very vivid experience with abuse, having been abused by the Romans and then the Roman Catholic Church that grew out of that beast, and then by the Muslims for the past 1,400 years, then by the Nazis, and now by Muslims again in league with progressives. It is hard to imagine that anyone who has suffered this much for so long would be unable to learn the lessons as to how to properly respond when threatened. But sadly, Israel, under pressure from the United States, capitulated yesterday. And so I want to share what I wrote, what I had to say, because I predicted this result. I'm not bragging here. I wish it were not true. But I knew it would turn out exactly this way, and I said so. So here is my open letter to Israel. The dateline is October 7th, 2023. There are days that change our lives and some that alter the course of human events. October 7th, 2023 was one of them. Yesterday was another. Whether you favor Jews or the so-called Palestinians, Hamas's actions or Israel's reactions, the macabre mutilation of children, the desecration and rape of women, the enslavement of the elderly and of infants, and the mass murder of over 1,000 innocent people by sadistic savages screaming Allahu Akbar in service to their perceived God, galvanized the planet, with most siding with the perpetrators and against their victims. This harbinger of the demise of man and wake-up call for Israelis transpired for a litany of reasons, most of them political and religious. Earth is now populated by the amoral and immoral, the thoughtless and the unthinking, who have been beguiled into believing the Jews are the problem rather than the solution to what ails humanity, once chosen by God to be the shining example on the hill, the light in a dark world, the heralds and prophets. Israel and Yehudim have surrendered their calling, muted a message we all need to hear before this holy war against God people explodes into global conflict, which is right around the corner. And ultimately, billions succumb to man's madness. If you are Jewish and you are aware that you're being targeted and abused now everywhere on earth, so I must ask, are you ready and willing to die? It's not a threat. Instead, an assessment of where Muslims and their progressive collaborators have taken the planet. The current isolation and demonization of Jews in the wake of their massacre and subsequent defense is far more insidious, widespread, and entrenched than Kristallnacht on November 9th, 1938. The shrill sounds of broken glass and anti-Semitic diatribes should have sounded an alarm back then, but instead it opened the door to the Holocaust and to World War. Did the same thing happen on 10/7/23? Yahweh's prophets say yes. So do I. Unless something changes radically in the minds of men and women, October 7th, 2023 will ignite a far greater conflagration. This dress rehearsal for the impending apocalypse will be repeated in Israel at least 100-fold, perhaps 1,000-fold, with the ensuing religious war serving as the catalyst for a world conflict that's going to claim billions of lives, and not in our distant future. I do not state the obvious to be alarming, but to be forearming. I choose life and prefer truth. I am a herald for Israel and for the God who still loves his people. I am calling you home before our homes are all shattered. The present situation is dire, at least for all but a select few, because there are no longer any viable options, only desperate choices. The world is so inculcated with lies. The truth has never been less popular or unappealing. The behavior of the Islamic terrorists on October 7th, 2023, and that of the international protesters that are amassing in support of them has become symbolic of how far humanity has fallen. Mankind has forfeited the ability to reason and to be moral. We are witnessing hell on earth, and this is just the beginning of the end. A rough introduction to the horrors that will follow over the next decade. It will be the most catastrophic in human history, albeit with a glorious conclusion on October 7th, 2033, when we celebrate Sukkah in year 6000 Yah. So that you are aware, there once was a sane response, a lone voice calling out in the wilderness of words a score of years ago. But he was drowned out by the din of political platitudes and religious rage. Back then, I explained that the only way to survive the otherwise inevitable plague of Islamic terrorism was to quarantine it, as one would do with any virulent disease. It is deadly, after all. This meant leaving them alone. It was the only way to protect innocent life. The rest of the world should not attempt to solve Islam's inability to live in peace among themselves or with others. Nor should Muslims be appeased, especially by giving them another state to manufacture additional terrorists, while calling that grievous error a solution. And we should not allow those carrying this plague to migrate into other lands and infect non-Islamic nations, because they bring the disease with them. And for it, there is no treatment. The ills of Islam must be quarantined. Now, I say this to you not as someone who has garnered an opinion, who has an emotional appeal. It's someone who is allied with some political party, some conspiracy, or a religion. I'm anti-religious. I am apolitical. I am opposed to all conspiracies. I serve Israel on behalf of Yahweh. That is my lone agenda, is to reintroduce God to his people and to reacquaint them with their Messiah and Son of God, our King, David. Yes, I have done my homework, more than anyone in human history. This 5-volume series called Goddamn Religion. It's over my left shoulder. You'll see it in the hardback form, all 5 volumes in that series. It is the most comprehensive, chronological, the best documented, historically validated assessment of Muhammad's words and deeds and the subsequent Quran ever written. I have composed translations of the Quran and the Hadith, all arranged together to excoriate the religion. The evidence that I bring from the oldest 5 Islamic sources against Islam to prove my case against this death cult is absolutely irrefutable. It is proven thousands of times over. And you can go to goddamnreligion.org to read it. Now, when I wrote this open letter, and it will continue in a moment, to Israel, what I had done is I had written a book called Tea with Terrorists. It chronicles my meeting with Al-Qaeda, Hamas, Hezbollah, and Islamic Jihad almost immediately after 9/11 and the suicide bombings of America's Twin Towers and Pentagon. I asked them these terrorists why they killed. And they cited the Quran and Hadith. They told me they were following Muhammad's orders and Allah's edicts in the Quran. And when I returned, I not only wrote that book about my experience, I devoted the next 2 years to this one, Prophet of Doom. Perhaps you've seen it. It was the first to take the Quran and set it into chronological order and set it into the context of Muhammad's life using the Tarikh, which is the history of Muhammad, written by Ibn Ishaq, Al-Tabari, and then the Sirah, which is the biography of Muhammad, written by Ibn Ishaq, and to use those hadith collections to reorder the Quran, set it into the context of Muhammad's life so that every word could be understood. And now, it was beginning on the 10th of October, 2023, that the God of Yisrael asked me to rewrite that book, to be far more comprehensive, to share everything that I had learned over the ensuing 22 years. And that has led to the 5 volumes of Goddamn Religion, all free at goddamnreligion.net. So when I make a claim regarding Islam, you need to know that there's no one on the planet that knows the religion better than I do. And if you want to join me in understanding why Muslims fled into Israel to rape, torture, terrorize, abduct, and murder, and then why those crimes were celebrated that same day in Gaza amongst the so-called civilians who were also Muslims, and why it broke out into a celebration of death and genocide against Jews and a cacophony of lies worldwide, far worse than what occurred in Europe in the 1920s and 30s, then you're going to want to avail yourself of that book. Now, continuing with my open letter. The rest of the world should not attempt to solve Islam's problems. They should not attempt to live in peace with this religion or invite Muslims into their homes. Muslims should never be appeased. They should never be given a state carved out of the heart of Israel, even though that is what's going to occur, and soon, probably in May of 2026. It should not be allowed to carry this plague into non-Islamic countries because the disease is lethal, and the only cure for it is not well understood. And that's the Torah, Prophet, and Psalms of Yahweh. For that, I offer 35 books on the shelf at yadayah.com. Therefore, the ills of Islam must be quarantined. Non-Muslims must stop enabling Islamic terrorism by continuing to purchase oil from Islamic fiefdoms and dictatorships. If the world refrained from invading their country, as America has done repeatedly, stopped enriching them, and no longer appeased them while isolating their religion to places it has already ravaged, Muslims would be limited to bludgeoning one another with sticks and stones. That's sad, but it can't be avoided. And should someone protest that these measures are too extreme, quarantining an entire religion, even though they are non-lethal strategies, non-violent strategies, and overwhelmingly deserved, it is already obvious that by doing the opposite, rage is running rampant. The merciless are abusing the innocent who are now cowering in fear. Rape has become the culture of the United Kingdom. Terror and intimidation, the culture of America's and Europe's streets and universities. The inferno was ignited in Arabia. It torched the Middle East and then Africa, and is currently smoldering in Europe and then the New World. Whether you know it or not, the fact is that year one in the Islamic era begins with the Pledge of Aqaba. The Pledge of Aqaba states, we pledge to wage war against all humankind. And they have. The first battles of Islam were against the very families that gave birth to these Muslims. They attacked their own. They robbed their own families. They murdered their brothers, their fathers, their sons. They abducted them. They tortured them. They gloated over them. They did everything that reoccurred on 10/7. But that was not enough. Because Muhammad then turned on the Jews of Yathrib. He committed genocide. He cut off the heads of the men. He stole their homes. He and his men raped the Jewish women. They enslaved the children. And then their wannabe God in the Quran took credit for it all, celebrated the terror. It's all documented in goddamn religion. It's all undeniable. And when they had rid Yathrib of what was likely 30,000 Jews at the time, killing them, enslaving them, torturing them, raping them, the few that had escaped went to a farming community of Kabar. And following the capitulation at Hudaybiyah, it's a story that is essential to understand if you want to deal with Islam and understand why you should never do a deal with the devil. Muhammad's militants almost turned on him because they wanted to satiate their bloodlust. They wanted someone to rape. They wanted someone to plunder. So Muhammad took them to Kabar. And there he laid siege. It is where the prayer of fear first emerged, Allahu Akbar. They tortured and killed the Jewish men. They raped the Jewish women. They enslaved the Jewish children. They stole their properties and homes. They had perpetrated genocide in Arabia. This is the birth of Islam under Muhammad. It is something you need to understand if you're going to save yourself from this disease. And considering what I just said, quarantining this disease, allowing them to do whatever they want in the 55 Muslim majority countries. Don't change a thing. Don't invade them. Don't encourage them. Don't do what America did in Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Don't do what the world has done to encourage Islamic terror by aiding and abetting the Fakistinians in Gaza, Judea and Samaria. Just leave them alone. But do not invite them into your home. Now, some would say, wait a minute, I know a Muslim and he's peaceful. He's a bad Muslim. Not my opinion. Irrefutable fact. The Quran goes on and on to define a good Muslim and a bad Muslim. There is no such thing as radical Islam. There are only good Muslims and bad Muslims, according to the Quran, and Allah's word on this is all that matters in this religion. A good Muslim is a jihadist who fights to kill in Allah's cause. Period. End of conversation. It's repeated over and over again. It's unequivocal. A bad Muslim is a hypocrite, according to Allah, because they won't support or fight in Allah's cause to kill non-Muslims and particularly Jews. And because that makes them hypocrites and therefore really bad Muslims, Allah orders the good jihadist Muslims to kill them so that Allah himself can torture them forevermore in hell. So let's not delude ourselves. Let's not define what Islam is or isn't by a personal anecdote that you may have. It is as the Quran reads. It is as Muhammad lived. So the merciless are abusing the innocent, who are now cowering in fear. The inferno, this declaration of war, born in Arabia, first torched the Middle East. After annihilating Jews, the first Muslims immediately after Muhammad's death fought the war of compulsion to force all Arabs into Islam or die. And then over the next 100 years, they unleashed horror on the world. They killed a third of the world's population as they raped and plundered and bludgeoned their way all the way from India to Morocco, even into France and Spain. Whether trying to dampen the flames or to fuel them, the planet's superpowers are on opposite sides and are being drawn into the last and most horrific war that will be fought on planet Earth. 2 decades ago, I proposed a third response to thwart the onslaught of Islamic terrorism beyond quarantine Islam so that it cannot affect the rest of the world, beyond no longer buying oil from them so that you're not financing your own demise. There was a third response to thwart the onslaught, and that was to expose and condemn the religion with words. You see, words, wielded wisely, are the most powerful weapons in the world. I don't want you to be violent. Do never lash out in violence based upon something I have said, because I will condemn it and have condemned it. Use your words, but make sure that your words matter by first coming to know the truth. Take the first step. I wrote Prophet of Doom so that you might know the truth and be equipped with the truth so that you could wield words wisely. And now, with the 5 volumes of goddamn religion, there is no excuse. You can be part of the solution. You can know the truth. You can wield words wisely. Back then, it was as simple as isolate Muslims in Islamic countries, debilitate jihad economically by not doing business with Islamic dictators, and 3, expose the religion's sadistic intent using evidence and reason. Now, it's too late as we sit here in January of 2025 for resolutions 1 and 2 to be effective. I just want you to know that they would have been 21 years ago. The cancer has metastasized, but there is still merit to the third approach, especially for Israel and for those interested in knowing Yahweh. Not only is the nation's survival dependent upon it, but so is the Messiah's return to fulfill Kippurim, which is reconciliations, on October 2nd, 6:22 p.m. in Jerusalem in 2033. And that Messiah has a name. He has a reputation. He has accolades given by God himself. He is the Son of God. He is his firstborn. He is our Messiah. He is the King of Kings. He is the Zeroah, the sacrificial lamb. He is our shepherd. The 89th Mizmor, which we're sharing in other programs, was written by God himself. to make us aware of his beloved Son and our Savior, David. Disavowing religion is the first of 5 to 7 steps, depending upon whether one is looking toward the Bereth covenant or the Mikra invitation, as they reconcile one's relationship with God. And ultimately, that is Israel's and the planet's only hope, the only antidote for the terror that is headed this way. Throughout the books which comprise the Yahowah brand, and while speaking boldly on thousands of radio broadcasts, I predicted that the world's counterproductive response to 9/11 and 01, with the invasions of Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and Libya, would make a bad situation far worse. No one else was doing so. I was right. I was right then, even though I was a lone voice, and I am right now. I addressed the inevitable consequence of the subsequent deprivation of liberty and livelihoods to thwart a virus bankrupting nations and human character. A decade before the invasion, I warned those who would listen that a proxy war fought by arming Ukrainians to battle against the nation with the most nuclear weapons would backfire, leading to catastrophic economic and military consequences. I was right then, when no one else was. I also foresaw how a new monetary alignment and reset, known today as BRICS, would undermine fiat currencies, beginning with the dollar, and cascade the world into chaos and anarchy. And now, I am predicting that Iran and Saudi Arabia, Russia and China, and a host of other belligerents are maneuvering for the second phase of what will become a march to madness, to the end of the world as we know it. And as of yesterday, we saw the United States play its role to make another bad situation far worse. Today is no longer like yesterday, and tomorrow will be different and more unsettling still. There is only one viable alternative, and you will find it at yadayah.com. Having studied the prophets, I know how calamitous the next decade is going to be for the inhabitants of this blue sphere spinning in space. For this reason, I have returned, as I have shared, to augment what was Prophet of Doom and is now the 5 volumes of Goddamn Religion. However, I am no longer writing to Muslims or to Christians, neither Europeans nor Americans, but to Jews in Israel. And even then, the audience is further narrowed by discounting those on the far left as progressives who wouldn't know right from wrong if it hit them between the eyes, or the far right, especially the Haredim, whose religion has poisoned their minds, causing them to be parasites. They are all too far gone to listen, much less to save. And make no mistake, it was the shrill voices of the most liberal of the progressives in Israel that wanted to tear down the government of Benjamin Netanyahu, and have wanted to do it for a very long time, that played into Hamas's hands by dividing Israel and screaming for a negotiation that would bring the hostages home, as opposed to do it the intelligent way. And finally, Israel capitulated, gave them what they were screaming for, and the consequence is going to be millions of Jewish lives. Therefore, I have decided to forestall our journey of discovery into how Islam began 1400 years ago so that we can discuss what it has become and what it has done. Its full potential is about to be unleashed, and while Islam has nothing to say about enhancing life, it has perfected hastening death. I began composing my thoughts on these matters before the sun rose. On that day of destiny, I was nearing the completion of a periodic update of the books that you will find on the shelf of YadaYah.com when my wife entered my study shaking in tears. The first images of estranged boys and raged boys and men entering Israel, almost all of them Muslims, most of them civilians. The vast preponderance of them were not Hamas. They were not part of any militant organization, unless you recognize all of Islam as a militant organization. It was beginning to appear on social media, and it was so incredibly odd because they were pausing for selfies. They were filming their own atrocities and live streaming them. And yet, the IDF was nowhere to be found. Israel failed to defend its own people. At that time, I was translating Yahweh's remedy for Gaza as spoken through the prophet Zephaniah. Over the next few days, I completed my review of Volume 5 of Observations entitled Understanding, where the following assessment appears. Then on Friday evening, just after sunset, I delivered this message that I'm sharing with you on Yada Yah Radio. It has now been replaced by the Yahweh blog that you will see on my Facebook page, my X account, and my YouTube channel, all under Craig Wynn. So it now seems appropriate that I share it with you again. And it is with a heavy heart, having forgone sleep at that time, that I reached out for one last gulp of coffee that evening prior to sitting down before a microphone on my desk and reporting. Considering the circumstances, I want to introduce myself and explain why I am addressing Israel. My name is Craig Wynn. I have written 35 books under the banner of the Yahweh brand. Yada means to know, and Yahweh is God's one and only name. They are all free online and available without royalty in printed form. Along with them, you will find a transcript of this message on the website. It's still there. Over the past 2 decades, I have served as an expert witness on the threat posed by Islamic terrorism, appearing on some 5,000 syndicated talk radio programs. Subsequently, I have produced another 5,000 radio programs and podcasts as the voice of reason to explain religion, politics, and world events, in addition to commenting on my first love, the Torah and prophets of Yahweh. My commitment to save Israel began 22 years ago when, on Teruah trumpets, the Moed, eternal witness to the restoring testimony that Jews have replaced with the Babylonian New Year as Rosh Hashanah. It was the 19th of September in 2001, 8 days after America's comparatively tepid version of the Islamic terrorist attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Yishak, and Yaakov, the inspiration behind the Torah, Nabi, wa Mizmor, teaching, prophets, and Psalms, asked me to devote the rest of my life to saving Jews from themselves and from those who hate them. On that day, I was tasked to begin where we are today, dealing with Islam, the deadliest and most destructive religion ever conceived. That same year, I flew to Israel and arranged meetings with Islamic Jihad, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda. I remember it like yesterday. Them holding guns to my head in what was a equivalent of an underground dungeon, where I was equipped with a pen. And they methodically told me of the people they had killed, those they would kill, and revealed the motivation for the terror that they had and would continue to impose upon the world. Based upon what they told me while they were holding automatic rifles to my head, I returned to write Tea with Terrorists, who they are, why they kill, and what will stop them. The title chapter, Tea with Terrorists, recounts my meeting that day. Thereafter, I returned and I wrote Prophet of Doom, Islam's terrorist dogma in Muhammad's own words. It was irrefutable because I used the most respected hadith as they were arranged in the life of Allah's Messenger by Ibn Ishaq and the history of Islam by Al-Tabari to rearrange the jumbled mess of the Quran chronologically. In this way, I was able to set it into the context of Muhammad's putrid life, expanded now and updated, even repositioned to protect and awaken Israel. Goddamn religion remains the best documented and completely accurate, the most thorough and comprehensive, contextual and chronological presentation of the Quran ever written. For having done so, I have received thousands of death threats. Not that it mattered, because I have protection vastly superior to the Iron Dome, Yahweh's Malachim, spiritual messengers and implements. 4 years later, beginning in 2005, I received a promotion and left the hellish experience of Islam behind. Well, that was until 2023 when I re-engaged to rewrite Prophet of Doom as Goddamn Religion. I have composed 22 additional books based upon my translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls, 3 additional on the Masoretic text of Daniel and Ezekiel, entitled Babel, which excoriate Judaism, and 5 more disproving the Christian New Testament by comparing its nonsense to the Word of God as it appears in the Torah and prophets. Those books entitled Twistianity, you'll see one with the cover over my right shoulder. I am the only person to have done these 4 things, not only writing the most effective denouncement of Islam, but also authoring volumes disproving Christianity and Judaism, while at the same time providing inspiring validations for Yahweh's testimony. Billions of people have passed this way. Only one man has done these things. There are thousands upon thousands of profound insights presented throughout the Yada Yahowah series and the entire Yahweh branded collection of books, which are revealed for the first time, these insights, in 2,500 years. By reading these Yahweh branded books, you will come to know God as he presented himself to his people. I share this with you, Israel and Yehudim, because your God, Yahweh, asked me to do this for you. Then he made it possible to discern what I'm sharing with you. He did so because he wants to save you from yourselves and from your religious and political enemies at the same time. The very survival of Israel and the world at large is hanging in the balance. According to Yahweh, and if you're listening to this message for the first time, you would have no basis for knowing this, but it is proven overwhelmingly on the books on the shelf at yadayah.com. Had God not collaborated with me, having chosen and then empowered me to reveal this message to you, the earth would be destroyed. He wants you to listen to what he has taught me and what I am now sharing with you. I am supremely confident that Yahweh will prevail because he has told us that he will. His message will resonate with a significant number of Israelis to spare a remnant of Jews and perhaps as many Goyim before his return. It is why I'm speaking to you at this time, in this way. However, sickened by what I've witnessed, I have had some rough nights. Immediately when I delivered this message to Israel, the first time I had not slept in days, and the last 2 nights have been difficult, as well as I am now returning to share it with you again after Israel's capitulation. So I may be slower of mind and thicker of tongue than I would normally be, but that's okay because, well, Moshe, the first of the 3 Zeroah, complained similarly, and Yahweh managed to use him in a most powerful way. As I read these words that I had written on the 7th and 8th of October, 2023, I was engaged doing on that day what I had done every day, 12 hours a day, for, at that point, 22 years, when on that Saturday morning, the 7th of October, 2023, an hour before sunrise in the Caribbean, I witnessed Muslims from Gaza breaching the fence erected to keep them at bay. They were so excited. They were posing for their rad adventure for their social media accounts. And who knew at that time how disgusting their celebrations would be, not only in Gaza, but around the world and on college campuses and in the streets of America and in Europe. And as they celebrate today what they perceive to be their great victory over Israel, when their abduction of Jews has been rewarded by trading them for murderous Islamic terrorists. At the time, I was contemplating Yahweh's depiction of Gaza and his disgust with the mythical people known as the Palestinians. I had introduced his assessment with these words: of all of the people cluttering this planet, the vile souls masquerading as Philistines while terrorizing Jews are among my least favorite. This same realization is true with Yahweh, and he just so happens to be God. He inspired these words through his prophet. Indeed, Gaza will be abandoned and rejected, and Ashkelon, speaking of worthless garbage and repulsive excrement, will approach an uninhabitable wasteland. Ashdod, those who deal treacherously and are violently destructive, cruelly assaulting others as devastating thieves, will be driven out and expelled by midday, while Ekron, the uprooted, cut off, and plucked away, will be uprooted and tossed away. Zephaniah. Yahweh's treasures are stored up for another time, Zephaniah 2:4. The names of these places are sufficient to explain what God thinks of these sorry souls occupying Gaza. Fierce and forsaken, the damned and destitute, abandoned and rejected, a pile of trash behind a gate of dung, worthless garbage and repulsive excrement, those who deal treacherously and are violently destructive, whose assaults are cruel and whose thievery is devastating, sadistically despoiling, while being brutally ruinous. God must have seen them these past 2 years. It could serve, of course, as the byline and mission statement of Hamas and the PLO, of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, or any Islamic terrorist organization born out of the Muslim Brotherhood, because they are all the same, including Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad. But whether they are confiscating what does not belong to him or them, no matter how many heads they decapitate, or suicide bombers who blow themselves to smithereens, no matter what name they have selected to obfuscate their true nature, Yahweh is going to depopulate them, adorning them in this horror that they inspired. They will be uprooted and tossed away. What was 10 years from the date I first spoke these words, and is less than 9 years away from the time I reiterate them to you. Infected with the virulent pandemic of jihadist Islam, they have become a deadly plague for which there is no vaccine. Out of quarantine and allowed to migrate and breed, this disease is spreading, and it's sickening the world. And understand, when I wrote these words, the riots had yet to break out. The intimidation and terror that is taking place in America's and European streets and on college campuses had yet not metastasized. But look what has happened in the interim. It is why the neighboring Egyptians, Jordanians, Syrians, and Saudi Arabians are so inhospitable to those pretending to be Philistines. While they all possess ample and available land and resources, there has never been an invitation from any of their Muslim brothers to join them. They understand that the Fakistinians are unredeemable and that they are serious trouble, and they have all expelled them or sanctioned them in all manner of ways. If you look at the fence between Egypt and Israel, it's just some spindly wires that are twisted together. But then when you look at the fencing between Egypt and Gaza, it's enormous. The Egyptians know. Saudi Arabians know. The Iranians know. The Jordanians surely know. The Syrians know. The Lebanese know that those pretending to be Fakistinians are serious trouble. They just use them as a means to bludgeon Israel, to exterminate God's people, and to remove the nation from this earth. They understand, yes, that the Fakistinians are unredeemable. They want nothing to do with them other than to use them as a spear to spill Jewish blood. God knows them as well. He sees them as toxic vipers who will strike and kill his people, should they be allowed to live among them. So mark your calendars, because Yahweh will impose his one-state solution 10 years from this date. In fact, now 8.5 years from this representation of this open letter. It will occur on Sukkah in the 120th Yobel year. It will transpire on the Shabat of October 7th, 2033, as the sun sets one final time on the enemies of Yisrael and Yehudim. Yes, in less than a decade, while celebrating the beginning of Sukkah, camping out with God, rather than the conclusion of the Mikra in year 6000, the anguish will be over for a receptive remnant of Yisrael. Yah is returning with the Messiah Dod, to celebrate the ultimate family reunion. Well, I am anticipating a wonderful party on that day. In fact, I am certain it's going to occur, and I'm going to play my role in making it happen. I write these words more disgusted by the world's leadership than ever before. Yesterday evening, as I spoke over a year ago, as we considered Yahweh's intent regarding Sukkah shelters on what was the Yada Yahowah radio program, celebrating the 8th day of camping out with God, crazed militants from the Islamic terrorist organization Hamas and Islamic Jihad and just ordinary Muslims were scheming with the theocrats in Iran to tear down the wall Israel had erected to keep them out. As the sun rose, bulldozers, which in saner hands are tasked with constructions, were deployed by Muslims to destroy the high-tech fence protecting Jews from them. Teenage boys, along with some of their others in their 20s, even many in their 30s, some 40s, armed with religious hatred and automatic weapons, some with just crude implements of torture, invaded the Promised Land. They were on foot and unguided, while others lined up to enter Israel on motorcycles and in pickup trucks. The scene, captured in celebratory selfies, was chaotic, uncoordinated, uncivilized, and noticeably evil. With surprisingly few there from the IDF to intercept their party or impede their progress, this death cult of marauding militants flooded in unabated and proceeded to savagely murder 1,200 Jews in cold blood. A quarter of them were kids attending a music festival. 40 children were either kidnapped or beheaded. They wounded 4,000 more, mostly in the streets and in their homes. The images were akin to the pogroms throughout Europe a century before. Per capita, the carnage on this day was 6,000% worse for Israel's 7 million Jews than the surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor in 1941 or the World Trade Center suicide bombings in 2001 were for America, although the Muslim attacks were infinitely more personal and vicious. It takes a special degree of hatred to mutilate people, to burn them alive, to cut off out their genitals after raping them, to making children watch as you gouge out the eyes and cut off the fingers and toes of their parents. The level of religious hatred and indoctrination to cause a man to celebrate such things can only be truly known by those who study the Quran and set it into the context of Muhammad's life as it is presented in goddamn religion. Know your enemy. Know why they behave this way. Rather than garner the world's collective rage against a terrorist culture more inbred, pervasive, and inhumane than Al-Qaeda or ISIS, Boko Haram or the PLO, Hezbollah or the Taliban, China, Russia, Turkey, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the European Union called for an end to the hostilities for the imposition of a two-state solution to reward those who had acted so savagely. It was surreal. Rewarding terrorism in this way would be akin to giving Japanese Imperial Navy Hawaii as a reward for their surprise attack, and then appeasing the Islamic jihadists who perpetrated the suicide bombings of the World Trade Center, give them Manhattan as a prize. It would be less sane than rewarding Hitler's growing aggression with Czechoslovakia, because at least Neville Chamberlain did so before the invasion of Poland, not after it. And now we know the name of the next Neville Chamberlain. I had thought that Biden was auditioning for the part, but no, he was too comatose. The next and last Neville Chamberlain is named Donald Trump. To call the approach heralded by Muslims and progressives immoral and insane would be far too kind. The fake Estonians kidnapped 250 Jews, mostly women and children. They beat some and they raped others prior to hauling them back to their sewer of religious rage, as if they were trophies. They would hold them as hostages, initially as human shields, which is standard operating procedure for these cowards, who are famous for using their own women and children in this manner. Even hospitals, mosques, and schools. Boy, did that ever turn out to be true. But the premeditated intent of their human trafficking would be to trade the lives of innocent people that they had ruthlessly kidnapped for those of convicted Islamic terrorists. I wrote these words on October 7th and 8th in 2023, only to see them fulfilled this day in Israel in January of 2025. It brings me no pleasure in being right. But since I foretold every aspect of this exactly as it would play out, you may want to listen, because I know what's going to happen from here. Should you be moral and rational, the events of this day served as proof that the creation of a Palestinian state would be suicidal, akin to reopening Auschwitz. As such, may the Yair Lapids of this world be remembered as the instigators of the opposition against Israel. Benjamin Netanyahu, Gallant, Ben-Gur, and Derry, along with the Halevi, Mr. Halevi and Barnea, will all have blood on their hands for prioritizing politics in their careers over Israeli lives, and for their inaction on this day, their dereliction of duty. Along these lines, there are many credible reports out of Israel that Netanyahu supported the ascension of Hamas in Gaza as a check on the PLO and as a way to influence the Palestinian Authority. It may be one of Bibi's scatterbrained projects that got out of control. If so, shame on him. The enemy of your enemy is not your friend. It is grossly immoral to associate with the immoral. But he, Bibi, is a man who often trips on his own ego. As painful it is for me to accept and report, it appears that as a concession to the Haredi, the religious factions of his coalition, Netanyahu ordered 2 of the 3 800-soldier battalions designed to protect the 60-kilometer border of Gaza with Israel to provide security for an ultra-Orthodox Sukkot festival near the flashpoint town of Hurara, located 30 miles north of Jerusalem. By highway and military transports, it is an 8-hour drive from Hurara to Beri, the epicenter of the violence. This past Friday, the BBC provided video evidence that religious Jews, this past Friday, this was a year and a half ago when I wrote these words, that religious Jews, after parading in the streets and deliberately antagonizing residents, tossing stones and vandalizing shops and cars, were confronted by a rock-wielding Muslim boy who was shot and killed. The IDF acknowledges that it used riot dispersal means to defuse the confrontation around the Sukkah festival and Hurara, confirming their presence. Some 60 Muslims were treated for tear gas inhalation as the town was closed by the military on orders from the coalition. Well, I have consistently railed against ultra-religious Israelis antagonizing Muslims, knowing that their violence was unacceptable and counterproductive. That was not the biggest failure of this day. The transfer of Israel's defense forces away from Gaza and the border left the 800 remaining IDF personnel vulnerable and overwhelmed to the 3,000 Muslims who penetrated the fence, as was the case for the Jews living nearby who were abandoned. I'm not one for speculation, but I have investigated this story and have affirmed that There was a large Sukkot festival, indeed, near Huara, that these religious Jews inappropriately provoked and acted belligerently towards the local community, and that the IDF was there to protect the ultra-Orthodox. This being the case, the IDF was out of position on October 7th because this day was observed outside Huara as Shemini Azeret and Shimchat Torah, both of which are rabbinical corruptions of God's message and have no place in his presence. To the extent that the IDF was understaffed where it mattered most, Judaism contributed to the carnage that followed and then offered nothing to thwart it. If true, and the story is readily validated, Bibi should go. And along with him, the entire group of Haredi and ultra-Orthodox MKs in his cabinet and coalition. That is not to pass blame. We all understand that they did not wield the knives that slit children's throats. They did not rape girls at the music festival, nor did they carry the captives back to Gaza as trophies. But they did kidnap the IDF at the most inappropriate time. Their lives took precedence over the 1,800 murdered, captured, and critically maimed among the Gazan border. Moreover, Netanyahu chose to leave them there, even as his administration discussed credible reports out of Gaza that it was about to erupt violently. They had a copy of the report, Al-Aqsa flood, and they did nothing about it. The Muslims called their terrorist assault on God's people flood of Al-Aqsa indeed, unaware that Yahweh used flood to predict the caustic influence of their invasion 2,700 years ago in Yashaya, Isaiah 17 and 18. In fact, it was after presenting these prophecies last year at this time that I predicted the events of this day. Yes, a full year before the terrorist attack out of Gaza into Israel that used aerial bombardments and then terrorists on tricycles with automatic weapons, ransacking small communities, taking captives, is exactly what I predicted and wrote about a year before those events transpired. I explained how there would be too many rockets for the Iron Dome to intercept and too many jihadists crossing the border to contain. I even foretold that they would infiltrate smaller border communities where they would wreak havoc unopposed, with the IDF arriving with too little and too late to protect Israeli captives. These predictions were all duly recorded a year prior to the events in the books that comprise Yada Yahowah, and also here on these audio programs. Like almost everything that comes out of the mouths of Muslims and progressives who coddle them, the truth was the opposite of their claims. But that did not stop the news media from parroting these lies of apartheid, of occupation, of colonialism and oppression as justification for beheading Jews. It was hard to watch as anti-Semites the world over applauded and Muslims celebrated, all duped by the myths they have promoted. Lying is essential to Islam. And not only are Muslims exceptionally good at it and susceptible to it, but progressive ideology has systematically disabled and the left's capacity to be honest, to be just, to be moral as well. As a result, the vast majority of people are being stupefied and deliberately misinformed by those who are devoted to what have become malignant ideologies. For example, There is no such thing as a Palestinian. There hasn't been one for well over 2,300 years. For the myth, even before the Philistines were exterminated by the Egyptians, the Israelites, under Dode, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and finally the Greeks under Alexander. They were known to be savage foreign invaders. Yahweh tells us they came from Crete. Their DNA now proves that he was right. They were so ruthless, so primitive, so uncivilized and cruel that even the empires that were built by slaves saw the Philistines as a liability. As a result, they annihilated them rather than enslaving them. There is no occupation, at least not by Jews. To their detriment and at the insistence of the Twistianity administration, Israel surrendered much of Judea and Samaria to the PLO, known today as the PA, ignorant of that disaster and how it created a breeding ground for terrorists. At President George Bush's urging, Gaza was surrendered, literally abandoned to be occupied by Israel's enemies. Those mistakes, along with the anticipation that the world would seek to destroy Israel's viability by continuing to encourage Islamic terrorists through the promotion of the two-state solution, all led to and contributed to the carnage of 10/7/23 and to its aftermath around the world. Believing that the regions they themselves were occupying, which were devoid of Jews, needed to be liberated to create a state named after an extinct group of barbarian invaders to whom none of them were related, fundamentalist Muslims terrorized the indigenous people of the land. Even worse, they were led to believe that Al-Aqsa was an Islamic holy site worthy of their protection rather than an assault on their intelligence and their credibility of their religion. In reality, the mosque and dome are trophies to religious rage, to barbarian invasions, and of political ignorance. Islamic claims on the Temple Mount and Jerusalem are born out of the most insane and immoral moments in Muhammad's putrid life. Following the debacle of the idolatrous indulgence, where Muhammad agreed to promote the goddesses of the Kaaba into his religion, and he even named them in the Quran, and then the Satanic statements where he said, well, we can look past that because Satan inspires all of Allah's messengers, called the Satanic statements. When Muhammad incorporated these three pagan goddesses into his religion and then admitted he spoke for Satan, Allah's non-prophet, he needed a diversion. So Muhammad, he championed the myth that while he was engaged in pedophilia as a 66-year-old man with a 6-year-old child, a winged donkey mule, an ass that flew, swooped out of the sky to fly him to the temple in Jerusalem. There he claims to have met with Jews who were long since dead. Dumb as the rock he promoted to God, he did not know that the temple no longer existed or that it had been torn down by the Romans 500 years before his journey into self-incrimination. Not done embarrassing himself, Muhammad, back aboard his flying donkey mule, claims that he leapt towards the Islamic heaven, leaving a hoofy print, which the Dome of the Rock commemorates. Having not been bright enough to think through the consequence of his story, if it had been true, then he was disclosing that Allah is found above Jerusalem, not the Kaaba. Nonetheless, now airborne, his first stop along the way was hell, which one has to pass to find Allah. There he reported that the inhabitants were fire-farting infidels, and that naked women were hanging everywhere from meat hooks through their breasts. Their crime, according to Muhammad in the Hadith, was not capitulating gratefully to the Muslim men who had abused them. robbing them of their dignity. One would think that this would curtail progressive support for the misogynist ideology, but stupid is as stupid believes. Life for them is a box of candy-coated toxins. Considering the utter absurdity and gross immorality of the Islamic scriptural support for the Knight's Journey, which is chronicled in the Quran, even though it's an absolute joke and farce, to claim the Temple Mount is an Islamic holy site, as Muslims and progressives commonly insist, is to be willfully ignorant and chronically irrational. To fight over it and kill to protect it is to be a Muslim, deceived, destructive, and deadly. As the foremost expert on Islam's corrupting influence in the world today, I watched in horror as Muslim boys ran through the toppled fence into Israel with the express intent of raping, plundering, mutilating, incinerating, humiliating, desecrating, kidnapping, and killing Jews. The younger and the more innocent, and the older and more feeble, the better. The pictures that these savages shot on their cell phones and GoPros showed that they were indoctrinated beyond hope, more evil than the Nazis, with no respect for life, morality, indiscriminately victimizing women and children. It was among the most depraved expressions of demonic behavior ever witnessed. And yet it's being celebrated in the streets of America and in Europe and on college campuses. And yet, today, at the forceful hand and influence of the United States, Israel capitulated and rewarded them, doing business by trading innocent lives for convicted murderers. That said, all of what we witnessed was actually a replay of what Muhammad and the first Muslims had done 1,400 years ago. They did it in Yathrib and in Kabar. Nothing has changed except some were on motor scooters rather than camels. And they wielded AK-47s and RPGs instead of knives and swords. The result of each event in the life of Islam was unjustified, inhuman, sadistic, barbaric. Predictably, with the helps of hundreds of thousands of co-conspirators, including the illogical and immoral progressives in politics, academia, and the media, Muslims went from celebrating the carnage they perpetrated and documented to playing the victim card. Bred to lie, they denied their decapitations and mutilations, the gang rapes, burning children alive, the torturous kidnappings, and the mass murders. And then they cried that they're innocent women and children. Those who had raised the terrorists to hate, and those these terrorists had raised to do the same, were unfairly dying at the hands of colonializers and oppressors who were occupying their land. I wanted to scream and vomit all at the same time. Hamas-controlled shrews would post grossly inflated body counts while inferring that their militant sons, now lying in graves of their own making, were innocent civilians. To advance the myth of genocide, to rid Gaza of terrorist tunnels, weapon depots, Hamas command centers, sniper perches, and booby traps, the IDF would have to raze the enclave to the ground. The world would scream, but not at the perpetrators who deliberately brought this on themselves, but instead those defending themselves from them. The UN would side with the devil and become an accessory to genocide. The UN is now a terrorist organization. 10 days after committing the crime of the millennium, these terrorists claimed that Israel murdered 500 innocent civilians and was committing war crimes by bombing a hospital, when they knew from the outset that one of their own rockets had landed in a parking lot where it ignited a stockpile of munitions, killing the terrorist guardian. Fact be damned, the leftist media and Muslim propagandists promptly condemned Israel for a crime the Islamic jihadists had perpetrated. Then on cue, legions of thoughtless zombies showed their rage by taking to the streets and assaulting Israeli and American embassies. Simply stated, the future is dismal and deadly for a world infected by this plague and too stupid to get out of its way. The best and worst of what I witnessed on the morning of October 7, 2023, was a complete failure of the IDF to stem the tide of Islamic jihadists. 8 to 16 antagonizing hours after the breach, there was no one to deflect the tide of terror, no one to thwart the passage of captured Jews back to Gaza. Not one of Israel's 48 serviceable Apache helicopter gunships, which should have arrived in 5 minutes and which would have salvaged the day with minimal loss of Jewish life, were deployed. As a result, Muslims massacred civilians in 22 communities and brutalized innocent Jews some 14 miles into the narrow country over the course of 3 days. During their prolonged slaughter, the drama seemed to play out in slow motion, without a coordinated response by Israel's government or its IDF. And so you may ask, what good could come about any of this? The answer is that my mission is to awaken Israel and the world to the horrors that will soon devastate those who remain estranged from Yahweh. While most are led to believe that they can trust their government, their military, their religion to protect them. Complacency and recalcitrance, combined with the false perception that their lives will continue on tomorrow as they have in the past, precludes the consideration of God's warning and his appeal. Therefore, proof of impending calamity is now required to awaken a comatose world from its collective stupor. As a result of the failure, the most revered institution in Israel, the one committed to protecting Jews, there has been a serious degradation in confidence in a nation already torn between the secular and religious. And now, on this morning, in January of 2025, after sacrificing more of its sons than were killed on 10/7 in terms of the IDF, Israel has assured that their sacrifices were now in vain, having capitulated and releasing the very terrorists who have and will kill them. It is tragic that men in powerful positions act this way, that they sacrifice the lives of their best and make them count for nothing. It's what America did in Afghanistan and in Iraq, making bad situations worse. What America did in North Korea and Vietnam. It's very common. It is exceedingly sad, and no one seems to learn the lesson. Between the secular and religious, the far left and the far right, and by judicial reform in a country at so odds with itself, it cannot even form a constitution. Jews are finally questioning, wondering who they can trust. And today was the final blow. Hopefully, more Yehudim, more Israelites will listen to what Yahweh has to say Embrace his name. Return to the Bereth covenant. Attend the Moed Mikre, restoring witnesses of the invitations to be called out and to meet with God, and that they will be saved from the impending carnage that will ensue during the time of Jacob's troubles. With this now being Israel's new normal and foreshadowing this horrible nightmare designed to repeat itself multiple times over the next, less than a decade now. A horrible nightmare, according to Yahweh's prophets, even which will spread out worldwide. There is the hope that God's people, Yehudim, the beloved of Yah, will finally stop relying on their military, their politicians, and their religion. Perhaps this will serve as a catalyst, promoting a remnant to return to Yahweh after what has been a very turbulent 3,800-year estrangement, with only fleeting moments of respect. Centuries before this day, Jewish rabbis in Yathrib helped create this deadly and demonic religion by reciting Talmud stories to an illiterate Muhammad for profit. They were then bastardized by Allah's messenger, this mass-murdering terrorist, rapist, and pedophile, to create the Quran. Without them, 80% of the Quran vanishes, along with any semblance of its credibility. More incriminating still, when Muhammad claimed that the Babylonian Talmud stories the rabbis had recited to him came instead from Allah, and when he twisted them to serve his lust for possessions and power, the rabbis mocked him, and they threatened to expose him. To prevent this, the psychotic non-prophet silenced them by torturing and killing them. The massacre of these Jews is duly recorded in Muhammad's Quran. Concurrently, to justify sadistic behavior, the Quranic diatribe insanely turned overtly anti-Semitic. 1,000 Jews in Yathrib were beheaded, raped, or enslaved. As a result, nicely played, rabbis. And yet you've never assumed responsibility for what you did. Israel, you are at war with yourselves and with your God. This is because the religions of your ancestors, those they created, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, have made Jews vulnerable. It is because you are unwilling to tell the truth about Yahweh or his counterpart, Allah and Islam. I shouldn't say counterpart, I should say the adversary, who is manifest as Allah and Islam. What I shared with you at the beginning of this open letter to Israel bears repeating. On Towrah, September 19th, 2001. Just 8 days after the Islamic suicide bombings of 9/11/01, I began serving Yahweh and his people by exposing and condemning their religious foes. At the time, there wasn't a single Jew who knew Yahweh's name, who had accepted the conditions of the covenant. There was no one on earth that was properly pronouncing Yahweh's name, that knew the terms and conditions of the covenant, that knew who the actual Messiah and Son of God was, or that David fulfilled Pesach, Matzah, and Makodim. They didn't know God's timeline. They didn't know the purpose of the Moed Mikre. They did not know the conditions of the covenant. No one. Little by little, that has begun to change, with 0 becoming 100 and 100 becoming 1,000 as we grow towards a remnant of God's people when they witness Yahweh's return with David, the Messiah and Savior, the firstborn of God, on Kippurim, the Day of Reconciliations, in Jerusalem, October 2nd, 2033. Now, less than 9 years from now. So I ask God's people, will you be here in Jerusalem on that day, celebrating life with Yahweh and your Messiah and King, David? Or will you be among those appeasing Islam, tolerating Judaism, relying upon the Israeli intelligence institutions and the Shin Bet and Mossad or the IDF save you from yourselves and from those who hate you? Or alternatively, Jews, you can continue to rely on the Mossad, the Shin Bet, the IDF intelligence services. But if you do so, you may want to ask how it was possible for reporters at the Wall Street Journal to detail the elaborate planning between Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas in the weeks preceding the attack, when Israeli intelligence either missed it or knowingly let it play out as planned. How is it that Israeli intelligence managed to disregard the IRGC and Hamas social media posts on Friday afternoon justifying the impending assault, the warnings from Egypt, and even their own surveillance videos of prior planning and resulting drills? The IDF had a 20-page dossier on the planned invasion, replete with Quran quotes and detailed operational plans under the flood of Alaska, which is a citation from the Quran, which they also ignored. And then we must ask why it took half a day for the government of Israel and the IDF to respond, considering that the Muslims breached the most high-tech impediment ever devised at sunrise and then lingered to take selfies. It was complete incompetence? Was it dereliction of duty? Hopefully it was not implied complicity. Since the very survival of Israel and the continued existence of the Jewish people is at stake, the implications here are palpable. For Israel, the nation's complicity in their own demise was reminiscent of Jezebel, the daughter of Ethabal, the ruler of Tyre and Sidon, marrying the immoral and incompetent Israeli king Ahab to promote the worship of Baal and Asherah. But this time, 2,888 years removed from that religious invasion, there is no Elijah, to sarcastically humiliate the constipated response of God's people. So why then and now are the most intellectually gifted people on earth so easily deceived and so complicit in their own demise? This should not have happened, and the consequence was the loss of precious lives and the fate of the people and nation. Israel, Jews, it's time for a self-assessment, for you to look around. The entire world has become galvanized against you. And it's not all their fault. To some extent, you have brought this on yourselves. Well, this story has not changed much since the Exodus. The final episode is just the beginning. Israel is playing a lose-lose game, one without any chance of success. There are only bad options as a result of ignorant and ineffectual leaders and a national obsession with all manner of things to the exclusion of Yahweh, who now plays no role in the lives of Yehudim. This predicament is a combination of three factors. First, 99.999% of Israelis are unwilling to acknowledge God's name, accept the conditions of his covenant, or respond to his 7 annual invitations to meet. Second, Israelis are unwilling to explain or accept the truth about the myth of the Palestinians, or why Muslims are committed to eradicating Jews. As such, they are flailing unsuccessfully at symptoms rather than the cause of the problem. Treat the symptoms, such as Hamas, and terrorism continues to spread. This plague is not only lethal, it was specifically created by Muhammad to target Jews. And third, most people have come to hate Israel, mislabeling and condemning the grieving nation's every move, while upholding the lies promoted by its enemies, even regarding the appalling behavior of the Islamic terrorists. In fact, Islam has made Muslims much more deceptive than Jews. No one lies better than they, and for this they have Muhammad to thank. He made deception integral to his religion. Therefore, the internet is ablaze with immoral and ignorant hypocrites playing the victim card. It's role reversal before a clueless audience. And then look what happened last night and today. Those who were claiming to be victims, even though there are more Gazians today than there were on October 7th in 2023. Those claiming the victim card are now celebrating victory. How is that possible? There is no longer any viable option regarding Gaza. Hamas is a symptom of a much more ingrained and pervasive problem: Islam. Fortunately, should you be ignorant of this reality, you hold the truth in your hands, or at least you could. The case against Islam is irrefutable in the 5 volumes of Goddamn Religion, because it is upheld entirely by the Islamic scriptures. I use Tabari's scriptural portrait of Islam's formation and Ishaq's biography of Allah's Messenger, the earliest and most credible Islamic sources of Sunnah, to reorder the Quran chronologically and set it all into the context of Muhammad's despicable life. Know your enemy. Come to understand that what happened on October 7th of 2023 to murder 1,200 people occurred because 1,400 years ago in Yathrib and then in Kabar, the terrorists of October 7th, 2023 were no different than Muhammad's gaggle of goons plundering Jews in Arabia at the inception of the Islamic religion. According to the Quran, all good Muslims are terrorists. The proof then and now is ubiquitous and irrefutable. Denying this reality will lead to more days like 10/7 and far worse than today. It will cloud the nation's judgment such that its resources are squandered, making a bad situation worse, as was the case with America's ill-fated and counterproductive missions into Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria following 10/11/01. It is, in fact, those horrendous decisions by America that I pleaded against at the time, doing 5,000 radio shows in opposition to it, that set up the events of last year and of the events we're witnessing in the streets. That is what caused the mass migration of Muslims. That is what changed the nature of the Islamic Middle East, such that America gave Iraq to Iran. And it gave Afghanistan to the Taliban, making a situation infinitely worse because it turned Syria over to Iran and to Islamic terrorists and put Iran in a position to arm and equip Hezbollah and Hamas. And then America, with its incoming president, has the audacity to tell Jews they better capitulate and trade Islamic terrorists for innocent civilians, or else. It's little wonder that the prophet Yeshaya, Isaiah, lashed out at America, blaming the United States for these events. Now, you may be surprised that Hamas is actually a Hebrew word. It speaks of violence, cruelty, and injustice perpetrated by those who are wrong. Hamas also transliterated as Hamas, first appears in the Torah in Bereshith 6:11, Genesis, where we are told, now the region in God's presence was perverted and corrupt, ravaged, rotten, and ruined. Moreover, the land was filled with Hamas, with violence, cruelty, and injustice, destructive, maiming, terrorism as a result of everyone being wrong and wronged, brutal killing, thievery, plunder, malice, and oppression, looting without moral restraint. Hamas. Bereshith 6:11. God inspected, and behold, it was ravaged and rotten, because the entirety of the animalistic nature of humanity, including their every proclamation, was perverted and corrupting, with their ways superimposed upon the earth. So God said to Noah, I am coming to pursue a time-constrained pruning, cutting away and separating, to place limits and restrictions on approaching my presence for all mankind, including all of man's proclamations, because the earth is filled with Hamas, with violence, cruelty, and injustice, terrorism as a result of most everyone being wrong, maiming and malice, brutal killing, thievery, and plunder, ferocious oppression and looting, without any moral restraint. Because of their presence. Therefore, look here and now, I will ravage their pit and destroy them and their perverse corruptions along with the ground in this region. Bereshith, Genesis 6:13. Yahweh conveyed his appraisal of human depravity to explain why he decided to scour the region. In the process, he described the bloody birth of civilization and the effect of religious and political indoctrination. On the two terms he selected to describe our fallen state, Shakat, perverted, and Hamas, cruel, the latter proved prophetic. The influence of Hamas in Gaza has been to cause the region to Shakat, decay and decompose as a putrid and polluted slime pit of corruption and oppression where captives are held against their will. They are perverse and immoral with a troubling lack of integrity. The result is Hamas, violent cruelty and great injustice. They are Hamas, ferocious terrorists, brutally killing and wantonly plundering people while maiming them with malice, all without any moral restraint. This is God speaking to you, Israel. Are you listening? Should you not be willing to consider what Yahweh has to say? How about a contemporary voice, that of Yoshi Lando, his testimony as the leader of Zaka, the rapid response paramedic volunteers to search and rescue teams for the past 33 years, is credible. This week, his voice trembling as tears poured down and through his beard, he disclosed, and I quote, "We witnessed the mutilation of bodies of a family killed during the Hamas terrorist attacks that had been bound together and brutally tortured. On camera, he described the sadistic scene he found after entering a home in the kibbutz Be'eri. I saw a father and mother off to one side of their dining room. Their two children, a 6-year-old girl and a 7-year-old boy, were positioned next to them. They were all on their knees on the floor with their hands tied behind their backs, their heads bowed. Their bodies were tortured and then mutilated, one in front of the other. I wanted to know if the children had been forced to watch their parents suffer first, or if the mother and father were mocked as they endured that insult being done to their children. And when I say tortured, I mean to say that they were missing body parts. For example, their eyes were gouged out. Their fingers were chopped off. All of this happened, he said, continuing to fight the tears. And still they were not finished. In the middle of the room, there was a table. And those terrorists, they were sitting and eating the Shabat meal of this family that they had prepared. They ate their meal while torturing their children. And then after this happened, at the end of it all, they had a bullet. Then these sadistic savages peed on the lifeless and dismembered bodies of those they had tortured to death. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Islam. This is Islam. Landau said that he and his team saw evidence of torture and systematic genital mutilation and rape throughout the Kibbutz Be'eri. Second only to attacking children at the music festival, the farming community was the epicenter of the October 7th invasion of southern Israel. It was where they murdered and mutilated more than 100 men, women, and children. Quote, "We saw a naked and bound teenage girl who had been beheaded. More than 20 were set ablaze and burned alive. In one home, a pregnant mother was mutilated with her unborn baby gouged out of her belly. An infant was roasted alive." Please allow these words to sink in. If you want to follow the link to the massacres of this day, it's presented on the YadaYah.com website. I should not have to explain, but since Muslims and progressives have lost their moral compass, it is important for you to know that the Islamic assault on Israel on October 7th ranks among the most depraved and cruel episodes in human history. And while there have been individual outcasts and malcontents who have become infamous for torturing and killing random victims, and while the Romans and Nazis tortured and murdered many more victims, this was an atrocity of an entirely different hue. After being prepared and inspired by their religious and political leaders, some 3,000 enraged and bestial young men invaded a neighboring country intent on sadistically humiliating, torturing, and terrorizing as many innocent civilians as possible, all while the entire community celebrated the carnage that these demons had perpetrated. For this level of depravity, to have affected so many people on such a massive scale, to perpetrate crimes this cruel and heinous, only to receive jubilant support at home in Gaza and worldwide, condemning the victims while proclaiming that the terrorists were heroes, is an affirmation that hell exists on earth and that man's days are numbered. Most are no longer worth saving. They're not capable of being human, and they are far worse than animals. They either torture and kill for their amusement, much like Allah is portrayed in the Quran, or they cry out in support of it. Time and time again, Muslims have demonstrated terrorism is their favorite tactic. The religion spawns terrorist organizations like the Boy Scouts encourage merit badges. But let's not confuse the symptoms with the disease. Hamas, Hezbollah, ISIS, Boko Haram, Islamic Jihad, the PLO, Fatah, the Muslim Brotherhood, the IRGC, the Houthis, and Al-Qaeda are sadistic death cults, to be sure. But they aren't the problem. Islam is. For example, even if it were possible to eliminate every Hamas leader, activist, supporter, and militant in a year's time in Gaza, Muslims would congregate under a new regime and continue to kill. It's like trying to cure cancer with an aspirin and a pair of toenail clippers. So let's take a moment and consider what Allah and Muhammad have to say about terrorism and martyrdom, fighting and jihad, and let's see if the outcome and the command are in sync. Quran 5:33. The punishment for those who oppose Allah and His Prophet and make mischief in the land is to murder them, crucify them, or cut off a hand and a foot on opposite sides. Their doom is dreadful. They will not escape the fire. Quran 5:37. The disbelievers will long to get out of the fire, but never will they be allowed to get out. Theirs will be an enduring torture. Tabari 8:122 and Ishaq 5:15. The prophet gave orders concerning Kenanya. He was a leader of a Jewish farming community Muhammad had exiled from Yathrib to Kabar. He gave these orders to Zabir, saying, torture him until you root out and extract what he has. So Zabir kindled a fire on Kenya's chest, twirling it with his stick until Kenya was near death. Then the messenger gave the order to Maslama, who beheaded him. Then, after making his wife watch the first Muslims torture and kill her son, Muhammad enslaved his wife, and he repeatedly raped her. This is Muhammad. This is Islam, as reported by those who killed alongside Muhammad. Quran 9:5. When the sacred forbidden months for fighting are past, fight and kill the disbelievers wherever you find them. Take them captive, torture them, lie in wait and ambush them using every stratagem of war. Ishaq 5:50. The Muslims meet them with their swords. They cut through many arms and skulls. Only confused cries and groans could be heard over our roars and our snarling. Ishaq 5:95. The apostle said, get him away from me, and cut off his tongue. Ishaq 3:15. Following Badr, which was Muhammad's first successful terrorist raid, where he robbed a caravan of merchants from his own community, Muhammad sent a number of raiders with orders to capture and kill the Meccans and to burn them alive. Tabari 7:113, Ishaq 3:87. When Muhammad saw Hamza, he said, if Allah gives me victory over the Quraysh at any time, I will mutilate 30 of their men. When the Muslims saw the rage of the Prophet, they said, by Allah, if we are victorious, he will mutilate them, as no Arab has ever mutilated anyone. Quran 8:12. Your Lord inspired the angels with this message. I will terrorize the unbelievers, therefore smite them on their necks and every joint and incapacitate them, strike off their heads and cut off each of their fingers and toes. This is the man, his God, their book, the resulting religion, and the reason behind October 7th, 2023. This realization is so vital to Israel's survival that I present the entirety of the 8th surah in the first volume of Goddamn Religion. It is well past time that the world become aware of what it is up against, what it has invited into its midst. The Quran's message is that good Muslims fight and kill and they die in Allah's cause, which is the subjugation and enslavement of non-Muslims and the annihilation of Jews. This directive is pervasive throughout the Quran. Since the 3rd and 33rd surahs are convincing in this regard, let's consider what Allahu, more commonly known as Allah, had to say. Quran 3:1. Alif Lam Mem. These letters are one of the miracles of the Quran and known, but Allah knows their meanings. Allahu, which means the for him. La ilaha illa huwa. No God but him. The ever-living, the sustainer of existence. Quran 3:3. He revealed to you the book in truth, confirming that which was before it. And he revealed the Towrah, which is supposed to be the Torah, and the Injil, which is supposed to be the Evangelion, or the Gospels. As Allahu will demonstrate by revealing his delusional and demonic nature, he is no more God than camel spit. Those who know better realize that God's one and only name is Yahweh. The Quran was not a book, but instead a mean-spirited rant, plagiarized, repetitive, contradictory, and toxic. 10 centuries would come and go before the hearsay reports of illiterate hooligans were committed to writing. 10 decades, I should say. The Torah is from Yahweh, and it was inspired and written in his name. It is in every way the antithesis of the Quran. Opposites are not the same. Yahweh is not Allahu. God's words are not confirmed by Satan's diatribes. Injil is a crude corruption of the Greek euangelion, which is comprised of eu and agelos, meaning good messenger or positive message. The term has been corrupted to gospels. However, while the Greek text was better written and more cleverly conceived, it seeks to annul and replace Yahweh, the Torah, and the covenant, the Messiah, and Yisrael. So it could not have been inspired by the same author who inspired the Torah, making Allahu a liar. As we proceed, these citations that I will share with you out of the Quran are comprised by compiling the most common renderings found among the 66 different English translations at my disposal, while closely adhering to the Noble Quran's interlinear, entitled Quran Word by Word. As such, any term or phrase and the parentheticals that are presented in the written form were added by Arabic scholars to either correct or explain the text. Quran 3:4 reads, "From before guidance for the mankind, he revealed the criterion. Lo, those who disbelieve in the verses, signs, and proofs of Allahi, for them is a severe and painful punishment. And Allahu, Almighty, fully capable of revenge." Allah and Muhammad convey the criterion of what it meant to be a Muslim. And those who claim differently are misrepresenting Islam. And lo, never forget, Allah is the most severe of punishers, and he relishes revenge. Allah not only admits to being a destructive force, abetting the demise of humankind, he promotes his prior bestiality and brutality as a means to engender faith. Quran 3:137 reads, "Lo, many similar situations were faced by those who have passed away before you. So travel through the earth and see what was the demise of those who disbelieved." This, the Quran, was a declaration for men, a guidance for an admonition for the God-fearing. 138. Then, speaking of combat, of losing the battle but getting back up to fight again, Allah says in 139, "So do not become weak against your enemy, nor despair, and you will be superior if you are true believers." 140, "If you have suffered an injury and have been wounded, be sure they have also been injured and suffer similar wounds. And so are the days we give to men by turns that Allahu makes evident that he may test those who believe and take martyrs from among you. And Allah who does not love the Zalimun, the deceivers, polytheists, and wrongdoers. So Allah is fishing for martyrs. While it requires sustaining and inflicting serious injury, while everyone has to take turns, and while even the mentally incapacitated have to pass a test, believers can apply by killing disbelievers because, well, Allah doesn't like them. In Islam, salvation comes to jihadists drenched in the blood of those they have slaughtered. It is by killing that Muslims punch their tickets to paradise. The perfect Muslim is destructive. 141, 2 and 3. This is so Allah may perfect the believers and destroy the unbelievers. Or do you think that you will enter paradise before Allah tests to ascertain those among you who have jihad, fought, striving hard, and who have proven themselves and they are steadfast? And certainly you wanted to die, previously wishing for death, martyrdom in battle before you witnessed and experienced it. Now you have seen it openly with your eyes. We just heard, and we will continue to discover Islam is a death cult, unable to give Muslims a reason to live. Allah gave them a reason to die. Too bad it isn't alone. But it does remind me of the old Beach Boys song, remember? Let's go dying now. Everybody's learning how. Come on and jihad with me. I'm sorry, I digress. With all due seriousness of a jihadist in heat, the true test of Islam is that once you have witnessed death, once you have experienced it, can you not only keep the faith, but celebrate the carnage? Because in Islam, everybody dies. But since that was Satan's intent, at least Allah is appreciative. I'm going to read this one line and we will rejoin this program on my open letter to Israel, drafted initially on 10/7 and 10/8 of 23. In our next program, this reads, Muhammad is no more than a messenger, and lo, messengers have passed away before him. So what if he dies or is killed? Will you turn back on your heels and go away as disbelievers? And whoever retreats and turns back on his heels, not the least harm will or hurt will they do to Allah. Allah will only reward the appreciative. And never does a soul die except by the permission of Allah. It is a determined decree. And whoever desires the reward of this world, he will give it to him. And whoever desired the reward of the hereafter, he will have that reward. To our appreciative ones. Since 100 billion souls have come and gone over the long run of Homo sapiens, this must mean that Allah has written a mountain of death decrees. I wonder why then he couldn't manage to write the Quran before Muhammad's death. Now we will return to this cavalcade of carnage in our next program. This is the Yahowah blog. This is my open letter to Yisrael. I am Craig Wynn. Good day.